Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining me. It is great to see so many of you here. Today I get to talk about something I feel very passionate about, and that is lean startup. And today we're going to be talking about the pragmatic steps to achieve a DevOps culture. And we're going to take a look at lean. But before we talk about transformation, because I've had a lot of great discussions here at EMCWorld about disruptive transformation and why we need to embrace a new way of working and new work patterns. We should talk about the why of the change, because everything we do should be with a purpose, for a purpose. So the reality is our world is changing. And the picture of the meteor hitting the Earth might look a tad dramatic, but let me share some statistics and data with you. You may remember an article that was written in 2011 from Mark Andreessen. The general premise of that article was software is eating the world. What he meant was software would become pervasive. It would become part of our daily lives. And if we fast forward 5 years, you can now see that Fitbit is tracking my steps on stage today. Oil and gas are using big data analytics to drive greater efficiencies in their business. And pretty soon, we're going to have a self-driving car. So indeed, the world has changed. In fact, I can't imagine an industry that has not been affected in a positive way by software. But yet, when I talk to many people, their work patterns, their way of doing business has not changed. And I think there's going to be a significant implication of that. So some people have changed, but many haven't. And I think that some careers may face extinction. Sounds a tad dramatic? Maybe. But if we take a look at the S&P index 60 years ago, in the 1960s, the average lifespan of a company on the S&P index was 60 years. The average lifespan of a company on the S&P index today is 12 years. So the world is indeed changing. But it's not all doom and gloom, because there is a better way. And that better way is to learn by doing. And that's what we're going to talk about today. In the process of learning by doing, you get to transform your team, transform your company, and you get to transform the most important asset of any company or any team. You get to transform yourself. Now, any good presenter realizes that this is not my time up here. This is your time. So I feel compelled to tell you what you're all going to get out of this presentation today. Today we're going to talk about my transformation and my team's transformation, and how we have evolved the way that we work and our work patterns. We're going to talk about the basics of a DevOps culture and environment. We're going to talk about speed to market. Speed may become your dominant value proposition in the new world, if there is such a thing. And we're going to talk about building a sustainable business, because at the end of the day, when we talk about building in small chunks and building minimum viable product, we really are talking about building a sustainable business with confidence. So before I go any further, let me introduce myself. My name is Brian Roche, and I've been with EMC for 12 years. During that period of time, I started as a software engineer, and I've been fortunate enough to lead many different engineering teams. With each of those engineering teams, I have strived to implement lean strategies and lean ways of working to essentially create a DevOps culture with what I would describe as varying degrees of success. That is, up until about 12 months ago, when I embarked on a new mission. That new mission had a couple of focuses. One, to build the first EMC pivotal Cloud Foundry dojo. Our purpose? To deliver to open source Cloud Foundry and contribute to open source Cloud Foundry. A second was to reinvent the way that we work, to change our work patterns, and to overhaul our work patterns. And I'm here to tell you today that we've been successful, and I'm going to share with you some of the steps that we've taken to be successful. Now, 12 months ago, the path ahead for me looked something like this. I'd read all the books, I'd understood all the principles, yet I had been somewhat unsuccessful. Now, it might seem weird, right? So the guy that's telling you, he's been unsuccessful is here to talk to you about DevOps. But the reality is that doing this within your organization can be difficult. But I have the opportunity to conduct many different dojo tours. And if you're in the Cambridge area, I hope that you'll come visit us and you'll get to see what we're going to talk about today in practice. But as part of those tours, People will ask me about software automation. How do we validate that the changes we're making aren't making, breaking functionality that we have previously delivered? And the reality is, there's no simple way to do this. You have to write the automation. It's hard work. And the same is true with transformation. You have to take this first step, and in the process, you have to remain hungry, continue to learn, and then you adapt that process as you go. So you remain hungry and you keep learning. Today, we're going to break down many of these topics and talk about them in more detail. We'll start with what changed the world for us, pair programming. Talk about test-driven development, continuous integration, and continuous delivery and why that's important. We're going to talk about the build, measure, learn cycle, why it's important to eliminate waste and to not leave inventory sitting around and to write only as much code as you need to. And of course, it's hard to talk about build, measure, learn without talking about minimal viable product. And then the glue that holds it all together, a balanced team working at a sustainable pace, and the importance of feedback. So if you talk to anyone at Pivotal and Pivotal Labs, they will tell you that at the heart of everything they do is pair programming. The essence, the secret to their success is pair programming. That's where our journey starts today. We start with pairing and laying the foundation. Okay, so before we dive into pairing, and I explain the benefits of pairing, I want to introduce you to someone. We'll have a little bit of fun. So I want you to meet Jackie. So Jackie started as a software engineer. Today, she's just been promoted. She's leading this great new team. They're responsible for this application that has many, many users. Okay, so people rely on this application every day. So let's meet Jackie's team. Jackie's pretty excited because Jackie has the A-team. In fact, if I were to describe Jackie's team, she has a team of rock stars. Everyone knows Jackie's team. If you plucked any one of those individuals, they would be phenomenal in their own right. They're like early explorers. They can reach newfound land. In fact, there's no land that they can't reach. Okay, no functionality that they can't build. They're like rock climbers working without a harness. Okay, they have the confidence to build rapidly and move rapidly. And of course, if you stop and talk to them in the hallway, they'll tell you that you're not going to understand what they're working on because everything they work on is rocket science. And you and I just quite simply couldn't understand it. And of course, they're superheroes. The reality is if they weren't here, our world would stop. Okay, so we just couldn't go on without them. Now, more than likely, Jackie's team sits in a location that looks somewhat like this. High-walled cubes. Her team is probably sprinkled throughout this environment, and it doesn't necessarily lend itself to collaboration. So things are going pretty good for Jackie and her team. She's noticed a few kinks, but nothing major. That is until today, when a massive system outage occurs. No one can access this system. So ordinarily, her users derive great value from the system. Sound familiar to anybody? So judging by the smiles in the audience, I think it does. So nobody can access the system. Everybody's locked out. And in fact, today, Jackie received a call from the CEO. Now, it was not the call that Jackie expected to receive from the CEO or the one that she'd always dreamed about receiving in her career. So like any great leader or any great manager, what did she do? Well, she pulled her team together. And she shared with them the problems, and she shared with them the challenges that her team were facing. No one can access the system. The system is down. And she was kind of surprised by some of the responses of her team. Some people on her team said, well, it's not a big deal, right? Just reboot the system, bring the system back up again, and everything will be good. In fact, this happens all the time. She's shocked by this reaction. Someone else says, well, I don't understand. Isn't this QA's responsibility to test the product? So before she knows it, the meeting devolves into the blame game. Everybody's pointing fingers, and they're not making any progress. In the back of her mind, she's thinking, there has to be a better way. Now, when I look at this situation in hindsight, I realize what's missing, something very important. They don't have empathy for each other. And because they don't have empathy for each other, by extension, they don't have empathy for the customer. So what can we do? What did we do in our transformation to deal with a situation like this? Well, it started with pair programming for us. Now, before I dive into the benefits of pair programming, let's first break down what pair programming actually is. So pair programming is the act of two software developers sitting at ostensibly one machine. They each have a monitor, they have a keyboard, and they each have a mouse. They both can affect the direction of the code. So typically, one person is typing, one person is driving, while the other person is thinking about the design ramifications of what they're doing. But they're both thinking about the strategic implications of the code they're writing. Now, this is where a paired programming team would sit in an open collaborative environment. And this is where our team sits in Cambridge. Let's talk about some of the benefits that working in this new way brings to us. So normally, when you bring a new person into a team, you go through a phase that we're all familiar with, norming, storming, forming, and performing. Now, and sometimes, you'll assign one person to work with the new person, and they're not thrilled by this opportunity. They're like, wow, I got to train the new person? Well, in our world, we're highly adaptive to change. So if you think about how we work, in the morning, we come in, we attend our daily stand-ups, and after our daily stand-ups, we pick our story from the backlog, and we go find our pair, and we go off and work. And we rotate constantly. We may rotate once a day, twice a day, but we're rotating all the time. And as we rotate, we're working in every layer of the stack. So it's not fair to say that we, don't care if somebody's not here or they're sick or they're on vacation, because we do. But it matters less because we all have context of the code. We've raised the water level of knowledge of the code equally across each member of the team. So we all have shared context. So when a situation arises where there is an outage, anyone could work to fix that outage. So of course, working in pairs, you've often heard the saying, 2 heads are better than 1. Well, 2 heads really are better than 1. Sometimes you're not quite on top of your game. You feel a little bit tired. And you've made some changes to the code, and it's not compiling, but you're not sure why. Well, more than likely, your partner is going to know what the problem is, and they're going to be able to spot it and get you back on course right away. Or they take over and drive for a little bit so you can kind of get your head back into it. So ultimately, it leads to better engagement. Paired teams work at a certain pace. So, funny story, if your team wins the Super Bowl on Sunday night and you've partied a little bit too much and you come in the next day, maybe you're not ready to hit the ground running. Maybe you're not, your head's not quite in it. But maybe your paired partner, or maybe the rest of your team, their team didn't win in the Super Bowl. And so they're ready to go. And so you can't let them down because we have empathy for each other. We showed up, we're here to work as a team, and we support each other. So we follow through and honor our commitments with each other. So it absolutely leads to better engagement as we all move along at a consistent pace and speed. And of course, in preparation for this presentation, I interviewed everyone on my team. I asked them, what they liked and what they disliked. And, they all love this new environment. So many people will say to me when they walk through the dojo, well, haven't people given up their privacy? They now work in an open paired environment. Nobody would go back. We continuously adapt to change, and we continuously adapt our process to meet our needs. So it's a pretty exciting place to be. Now, I know that there's some detractors, and they will, we'll often talk about, well, doesn't extreme programming lead to just-in-time design or just-in-time architecture? And, we just celebrated the anniversary of Kent Beck's extreme programming. And, Kent talks about, testing and integration and design, short iterations, the importance of building in small cycles. All of these things are important. Architecture, design, code reviews, writing the simplest code possible to implement our functionality. All of that's important. And because it's important, we do it all the time. So unequivocally, this does not lead to just-in-time architecture or design. These things are important, so we do them all the time. And we do them working in an environment like this. This is our new world. After we adopted pair programming, we tore down all the cubes, we got rid of all the offices, and this is the environment that we work. Okay, so let's go to our scorecard. Where do we stand? We've taken the first of many steps, but the one that changed it all for us was pairing. it caused us to develop empathy for each other. And when we have empathy for each other, we can have empathy for the customer. And when we have empathy for the customer and a shared responsibility and ownership, then we can focus on fixing the problem instead of assigning blame. And that's really what's most important. And of course, now that we're delivering higher quality code, we feel more rewarded as a team because we're getting more done on a daily basis. Okay, great. So we've taken the first step, but we still have more work to do. Now we have to think about validating the changes that we're making. And then we have to think about continuous integration of those changes and continuous delivery. And that's going to be the focus of our next section. Now, many of you may be familiar with this graph. Okay, what we're describing here is the cost of change of a software product over time. So I've worked on many projects where we go through a requirements phase. After we've incepted, we know what we want to do. And we go through sort of, a big design phase where we'll come up with these, maybe we'll engage with an outside agency, and we'll come up with these beautiful picture perfect designs and pixel perfect, and then we'll create the HTML and we'll implement all this stuff, and then we'll write, the implementation and the middle tier and the persistence layer, and then it'll get to QA, and then QA will find some issues, and then maybe the customer finds some issues, and we'll realize that, wow, we got to go all the way back to the analysis and design phase, and we're going to have to redo all those designs. We're going to have to re-engage with that external vendor to recreate, new designs and new experiences for our users. Well, if only we were able to catch some of these bugs and some of these issues earlier on in the cycle, then maybe we could affect the cost of software over time. And I think the solution to that is test-driven development. And again, this is another principle that we're talking about from extreme programming. But before we talk about the benefits of TDD, as we call it, test-driven development, let's talk about what it is. So test-driven development is the act of writing the test code first. So we write the test code, and that's describing what the expected behavior of the implementation will be. And we run that test, and we watch that test fail. Then we write the implementation, and we rerun the tests. And when those tests rerun, we would expect that they'll turn green. The third step, which is extremely important, is we refactor that code. So why do we refactor the code? We want to clean up that code because we want to make sure that we are writing only as much code as we need to ensure that we've made that test pass and implemented that story or that feature that we're working on. We want to make sure at all times we have lean code. Why? Well, if you change your lens or your perspective on code, if you think about code as a liability, the more code you write, the more code you have to maintain over time. If you go back to our graph from earlier, we talk about the cost of making changes later in the cycle. Well, there's a cost to all code that you write. You have to keep it working over time. So if we can write less code to achieve the same outcome, that's what we strive to do. And that's what I submit that you should strive to do also. Now, the great thing about TDD is that it provides us with fast feedback. We can quickly make changes, okay? And we can validate immediately that we have made non-breaking changes. We want to make sure that any of the functionality that we have previously committed continues to work. So for us, it gives us fast feedback. It's almost like our safety net. And so ultimately enables us to deliver higher quality. And then, of course, it helps us with deployment, which is a nice segue to continuous integration and continuous delivery and establishing this pipeline. Now, I'm fortunate enough to meet with many people in Dojo, as I mentioned, and talk to different folks about their work patterns. And many of them will say, I do lean. We're a lean team. We deliver every 2 weeks. And I think, well, integrating your code every 2 weeks is not what I would describe as continuous integration. What happens in our world is that we integrate that code immediately. So we establish a continuous delivery pipeline. And it basically looks like this. Step one is rewrite the code. We run, obviously, our test automation. Then we integrate that code immediately. And we have monitors within our workspace within an open collaborative environment that enables us to see the progress that code is making as it's integrating. So we can get immediate visual feedback of what's going on. If you're familiar with the Toyota production system or lean manufacturing, it's the whole notion of Kaizen. And then finally, we deploy that code so that we can get quick feedback from a customer. Now, this isn't a circle, but you can think of this as a circle, that happens all the time, right? We're continuously doing this. And of course, we've all worked in those projects where, you've been coding for like a year, you've gone through the QA cycle, and you're ready to package the software. And we got to go find the release engineer, and we got to go find the person who wrote the installer, and we got to dust off the code, right? And the reality is, for anyone here that works out, you'll know this: the more you work out, the better conditioned you are. And so, we're really good at delivering code because we do it all the time. We do it often. In fact, in our world, integration is extremely important, and if you look at extreme programming, we integrate our code 4, 5, 6 times a day or more, and we ship our code as often as we can because we want to get validation that what we're building makes sense. And the only validation that really matters is when we talk to the customer. So pace to market in this new world may be your dominant value proposition or your competitive advantage. And I think that when you think about test-driven development and continuous delivery, that's what it enables. It enables you to work in small batch sizes and get those changes immediately to customers so that they can give you that quick feedback. So it also enables us to be highly adaptable to change. And for me, adaptability absolutely trumps rigidity. So I don't know about you, okay? When I buy software, I'm not thinking that there aren't going to be issues or bugs. In fact, I think there's going to be, because it's software, and software physics are going to prevail. But what I do want to know is I want to have the confidence that that team is going to be able to rapidly turn around an issue that I have and deliver that change to me. And that gives me confidence to be able to take those upgrades because I know they're going to be seamless. I know they're not going to be massively disruptive or fail halfway through. And why do I know that? Because the team is delivering those changes on a consistent and constant basis. And that's what pairing, TDD, continuous delivery, and integration gives us. Okay, so checking in on our scorecard, we're not doing too bad, but we're not quite there yet. So I think of all of that, writing the code, qualifying the code, and delivering it, as sort of the first act of 3. Second act I consider to be extremely important, and we're going to talk about build, measure, learn. So let's transition from writing the code to figuring out how we determine what we should build and how we should get that to customers. So I would contend to you that the worst thing that can happen, worse than what happened to Jackie and her team, is that you deliver code and nobody cares. Now, startups can say to you, well, we haven't made a big splash, so we don't have any customers yet. It's not a big deal, we don't have any customers. What's worse than that? You do actually GA, you do actually deliver your code, nobody notices. Or worse, you have 2, 3, 4, or 5 customers. So how do we figure out what to build and make sure that we're on the right track? How can we implement the notion of innovation accounting? How can we quantify that the work we're doing is indeed solving customer problems? Now, it's commonplace in any one of these talks to make fun of some methodology. And usually that methodology is waterfall, or as it's finally described sometimes, water scrumfall. Now, in this talk, I'm not actually going to make fun of it. Instead, I'm going to talk about the pros of waterfall, okay? So if you're in an environment where all your requirements are well understood, you've got no architecture that you need to de-risk. In fact, you're living this world that's not changing rapidly, and your customer requirements are not changing, and you don't need to adapt to customer needs or your competitors' needs, then waterfall is perfect. But we already talked up front, that's not the world that we live in. So in my research for this talk and for adopting this DevOps and new way of working, I researched lean manufacturing and different ways of delivering software. Waterfall originated from manufacturing. So this is phases and gates notion, right? So water flows down this map. So we go from requirements to design and implementation and verification. But what's wrong with this picture? Dimming, Taiichi Ohno, arguably the godfather of the Toyota production system, said what's wrong with this picture is, where does the customer factor in? Not until very late in the cycle. And they contended that the customer should be pervasive. They should be part of everything that we do. And so we should change our way of working. I remember being in status meetings where we would talk about the milestones, right? What I like to call achieving failure, okay? We're moving from one milestone to the other with relative predictability. For me, that's not the measure of success in a software product. Because what you're doing essentially is you're building up potential waste. So you're building all this functionality that is essentially like fruit that's been delivered, that's sitting on the dock, waiting to make its way to the grocery store. You're writing all this code, but you're not validating that the work that you're doing is moving the needle on customer needs. And so this may very well be a picture of a typical software delivery cycle. Waterfall projects are typically measured in months, quarters, or even years. You incept, you go through a design phase, you build a product, you test it, and then you release it. And then it's that moment that you get feedback from the customer. So what's the solution here? Well, if you're familiar with the lean startup, Eric has talked about lean being a strategy for building software in times of extreme uncertainty. I don't know about you, but I think that we're absolutely living in times of extreme uncertainty. Our world and the world around us is changing rapidly. So what we strive to do with the build, measure, learn cycle and validated learning is to build in small chunks. So we form a hypothesis that a customer is indeed having a problem. We build some code, and we deliver that code, and then we measure the results of that code. So we essentially take the picture that you saw on the previous slide, and we shorten that into a day or as short a cycle as we possibly can, whatever makes the most sense. That's the essence of build, measure, learn. Okay, let's check back in on our scorecard. Building the code, qualifying the code, and delivering it. We're doing pretty good. And now with build, measure, learn, we're actually getting the code out there in smaller chunks, and we're validating that the work we're doing makes sense. So we've got less unvalidated effort that's sitting around. So we're still getting quick feedback with less waste. But it's really hard to talk about build, measure, learn without talking about another concept that is at the heart of build, measure, learn, and that's minimum viable product, or MVP, as we often call it. It's not about just figuring out how you build more quickly. It's extremely important to figure out what you're building and how you can do it more quickly. I would actually contend that the dominant question of our time is not, can a product be built, but should we build this product? If we built this product, would anybody want it? Now, I don't know about you, but I have worked on projects for a year, sometimes 2 years, where we've come up with these amazing designs that we're so proud of. We've delivered this awesome code. Sometimes we've delivered code that wasn't so good. And I remember sitting in these bug review boards, and we would question, like, what's the importance of this issue that we're potentially talking about fixing. And it would occur to me that why didn't we just ask the customer? Why wouldn't we just ask the customer? And in fact, I've worked on projects that at the end of it, we delivered it. The customer took it, and they said, this doesn't meet with our needs, right? This solution just doesn't work for us. And you fall back on what we always fall back on. Well, we learned something, okay? Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't really make me feel any better. We learned that this product didn't really, solve any customer needs. So then it occurred to me, well, how could we short circuit this cycle? How could we take that, 2 years of work or that year of work and shorten it down so we could get that validation quickly? So the answer to that is MVP, minimum viable product. And minimum viable product is at the heart of the build, measure, learn cycle. Think of MVP as how we can get through the build, measure, learn cycle as quickly as we possibly can so we can get quick feedback. Now, everything that we've talked about up until this point, TDD, continuous integration, constantly refactoring our code, all of that helps us get through the build, measure, learn cycle. In fact, it gives us the speed and agility that we need. Let's break it down even further. So I think of MVP as, we have this hypothesis. We have this crazy idea that the customer has a problem, but we're not really sure that we have a good grasp on the problem. So what do? We're going to form a hypothesis, and we're going to say, when we deliver a solution, it's going to solve the customer's problem, and the solution is going to look like this. And so we deliver that to a customer, and we want to deliver something that's valuable so they can give us meaningful feedback so we can decide if we want to pivot or persevere. And of course, why are we doing all this? Because at the heart of this is that we're trying to build a sustainable business. We're trying to get early validation, quick, rapid validation that the work we're doing makes sense to our customers. Now, we've worked closely with our friends at Pivotal Labs. In fact, they've helped us as we've gone through our transformation. And Hetty Stern is a product manager that we worked with very closely. And she will tell you that a user story is the smallest possible change that you can make that brings incremental value to a user. And I think that's right. So it begins with the what and the why, and how we can build this independently without roadblocks and deliver that to a customer so we can get quick feedback. So let's break down the build, measure, learn cycle. We'll talk a little bit about it in the abstract, but then I'll give you a specific example. Because oftentimes people say to me, well, isn't this just for a startup? Maybe this wouldn't work for hardware. Or this is not going to work at scale. So let's assume we live in a time where cars don't exist, okay? And we want to get quick validation. So we form a hypothesis. That hypothesis is we have this crazy idea that families want to move all of their families or their friends from point A to point B, and it's not tenable to walk. They want the ability to propel themselves and steer this vehicle. So what might an MVP look like? Well, there's plenty of infographics on the web that would describe what an MVP might look like in this case. Maybe you deliver a wheel. Maybe you deliver a door. I would argue that that's not really valuable. It's not really going to give you feedback. And so I would contend that your MVP should be sufficient enough to give you quick validation, to be able to get meaningful feedback from your customers. Now, there's a fine line, right? If you haven't been embarrassed about your first MVP, then you're probably delivering too late. And then, of course, as you iterate, okay, our target market is to be able to provide a car that can move multiple people from destination A to destination B. So in your second iteration, you're still not achieving what your product manager would probably describe as like MVP for this, target market. Okay, we're still maybe dealing with just early adopters. And then in iteration 3, you're probably able to carry some extra stuff, but you're still not able to carry all those people you want to carry. And it's not until iteration 4 that finally you can carry all your friends and all your family, and then we've moved to a broad scale adoption. Okay, so that's the abstract example. Let's talk about a specific example. Late last year, my team was tasked with putting PCF in the VirtuStream infrastructure, enabling customers of VirtuStream to push their applications to PCF. Now, we could have taken an approach where we went through a very lengthy design phase, and in a DevOps world, you will automate everything, right? So we could have gone through and automated the provisioning and deployment and so on and so forth. And we could have turned this into a, multi-quarter release. But instead, we said, what is our hypothesis? Our hypothesis that customers that use VirtuStream will want to use PCF and CF push their apps. So we said, well, what's the simplest thing we could do? What's MVP in this case? Well, we could install PCF in the orthogonal environment on vSphere, and we could put a tile in the Xstream UI, and a VirtuStream customer could click that tile, and that tile would invoke an email or some kind of a script to an operations person, and then that operations person would go through and manually provision an organization in PCF. And then PCF would take over, as it always does, and send an email to the user that the organization and the environment is ready, and then they can start to CF push their apps. Now, in a pure DevOps world, you would have automated all that. But we wanted to answer a simple question, and we wanted to answer that question quickly. Would VirtuStream customers use PCF if we enabled it in that environment? And so within a week, we were able to get PCF stood up in that environment. We were able to create the tile, and customers started to use the product. And when we knew we had customer usage, we then knew we had customers that we could talk to. And we knew that we had customers that we could ask questions. So we could continue to form hypotheses or fancy guesses of what they might want. And we could get constant validation that what we were doing made sense. And then, of course, we embarked on automating the provisioning and deployment. And as you heard in the keynote today from David, we have successfully delivered this. So we're pretty excited about it. Now, some people might say, well, of course, VirtuStream customers will want to use PCF. But the good news is that we were able to validate at every step of the way that what we were doing made sense to them. So that's an example of something at scale, something that could have been a really large project that we were able to break down into MVP and build, measure, learn in short cycles. And so, of course, it often arises that people say, well, how do you measure success in this world? Well, the lean startup, if you're familiar with it, is really, management and accounting, right? It's not really that glamorous or cool, right? Innovation accounting essentially enables us to create qualitative and quantitative metrics around what we're doing and whether or not it's making sense to customers. Why? Because we want to know as early as possible if what we're doing doesn't make sense. How many times have you been on a project that you've said, this is like a death march? Like, we know that the market has changed, but we're like so far into this, we can't change direction. It's too late now. It's never too late. It's never too late to put something out there and to learn. And it's never too late to pivot or persevere if you're on the right track. Okay, great. So if you examine lean manufacturing, they will talk about different types of waste. And in this talk, we already talked about inventory waste. And I could go into the other types of waste. In manufacturing, you have motion waste, where we have somebody working at a station. They're moving machinery around. We can talk about dependencies and waiting on your dependencies to be honored. But in this section, I want to focus not on inventory waste, but I want to focus on time waste. And I want to look at the old world that I came from. Okay, so we were lean, right? So I talked about trying to implement lean strategies, changing our work patterns in that old world with varying degrees of success. So what might our world have looked like? Well, we'd come in and we'd do our stand-up and we'd break. And then we'd go back to our cubes, or we'd go back to our desks, and we'd respond to some email. And maybe some of us were juggling 4 or 5 different projects, so we had conflicting priorities. Maybe we had 2 or 3 different bosses. But the point is that we had constant interruptions. So what does focus look like in our new world after we have transformed? And what should focus look like in your world? Well, every day is pretty similar. Now, there's variability within our day, but every day looks like this. We attend our morning stand-up, and after we get through our stand-up, we go off and we implement business value. We break for lunch from 12:30 to 1, and then we come back for the afternoon session. And all the time, we're focused and working on the stories that we said were important, that we took from the backlog in that morning. And we do everything we possibly can to eliminate waste. We don't do anything that doesn't contribute to delivering on that overall goal for the day or for the week. We do week-long iterations. So each day starts with a daily stand-up, and it's maximum 15 minutes. Most of the time, it's maybe 5-6 minutes. We do our iteration planning meeting, and this is not the time for us to write those stories. This is the time. The backlog should have been populated before we get into this iteration planning meeting. This is the time for the team to come together and understand those stories, understand the goals, the anti-goals, what the definition of success looks like for those stories, and to talk about any potential roadblocks that may impact us from achieving success. And then, of course, we have the last meeting on our calendar for that week, and that's the retrospective, or retros as we call them. So great things come in threes. Those are our 3 meetings. All the rest of the time, we're implementing business value. So how do we, more tactically focus on eliminating waste? Well, we want to avoid email. In fact, face-to-face is the most efficient way that you can communicate. Email, text messaging, probably the worst, okay? So we sit together. We locate teams so that they can work together. We put a PM there, a user experience person if they're needed, and all the developers sit together in this one environment. They sit together working on focusing and working on delivering that goal. So your space and tearing down those cube walls is extremely important to achieving this goal, the goal of focus. We also eliminate idle time, right? So some people will say to me, well, how quickly do your test suites run? Well, sometimes they take longer than maybe 20 minutes. Or sometimes we're deploying software before you can start working on a story. And anything that takes longer than 20 minutes, we will typically context switch. Now, pairing can be intensive, right? And that's also a good time for us to use a break. Maybe go play ping pong, play air guitar, whatever it is, we happen to do. But point is, anything that takes longer than 20 minutes, we context switch, we take a story from the backlog, and we work on that story. So all the time, we're watchful for waste, and we're figuring out how we can remove that so we can focus on a single goal. Okay, let's check back in on our scorecard. We're almost there. We've made a lot of changes. There's a lot that's happening in our environment that's now better. We feel happier. We feel more engaged. We're better focused. We sit in the same location, and we're productive. And this productivity, makes us feel, at the end of the day, we're pretty tired, but at the end of the day, we feel like we've achieved a lot and got a lot done, and that can feel very rewarding. Okay, finally, let's talk about feedback and balanced teams. This is really the glue that holds us all together. Let's go back to earlier in our talk. We talked about Jackie's team, when she brought them together to describe the problem they were having. What happened? People pointed fingers. It became the blame game, okay? What's wrong with this picture is that they didn't have empathy for each other. I think empathy is something that's extremely important. They each had different time pressures, but maybe they didn't understand why the other person had time pressures or conflicting priorities because they didn't pair. And so they didn't understand each other's perspectives and each other's lens in the world. They don't work together all the time. And so they don't assume positive intent. So, we're always trying to boil down what makes great teams. What's at the essence of what we do? So research was commissioned 5 years ago to analyze and understand this in more detail. What we wanted to do is essentially answer the question, what makes a great team? Now, the New York Times posted, an 8-part series on this. And the first part was focused on answering the question, how do people work today? And what makes great teams? Is it the A players that we talked about on Jackie's team originally? Those team of rock stars? Or was it, a group of people that could work together, each phenomenal in their own right, but working together to support each other? Well, the results of all this research was, it lasted for about 5 years. And we surveyed more than 180 teams. And the sad thing is, we didn't find any patterns. But we probably found data that is well understood by most great teams or most great leaders or managers or team members, that we like to collaborate. We're more social, we're more social in our teams now. In fact, 3/4 of our day is often spent socializing with each other and collaborating to solve problems. But what we did learn were there were, a few characteristics, right? There were a few qualities of great teams. And it really centered around team norms. Just like pairing when you pair with your partner and you kind of fall into that groove, great teams kind of establish team norms. We found that same thing that we find in our team, that people stop talking when they feel like they've been heard. They feel like they've been heard when they're able to speak their mind because they feel psychologically safe. They feel like they can share their opinions with their team members, and that their team members have that sort of social sensitivity to know, and to understand that person's perspective. And of course, follow through. We talked about showing up and being part of a team and needing to raise your game if you're not quite feeling it that day. Why? Because you want your team members to know that they can depend on you and that you will follow through on your commitments and what you said you would deliver. Now, where does all of this come together? Where do these sort of mini therapy sessions actually manifest? Well, in our world, we call them retrospectives or retros. And, for me, we don't have that many meetings on our calendar, but I would tell you without a shadow of a doubt, the most important meeting on our calendar and the most important meeting for our team is absolutely the team retro, because it develops real action. We generate, real action coming out of this. Now, in our world, it typically happens on a Friday. We have 1 week long iterations. So it's great that it happens right before the weekend, because we get to talk about all the things that worked, things that weren't so good throughout the week. And we get to sort of offload all that baggage before we go into the weekend. And then we get to implement real change so that when we go into the next week, we've adapted our process and we have a new process realigned with the way that we need to work. Because we work the way that we do today because it has worked for us in the past. But we're constantly looking for new methods and new ways of working and adapt those work patterns so we can be more successful and more efficient. So it enables us to get all of those, team issues, out on the table. And the reality is we didn't start with 100% honesty in these meetings, okay? So, we probably started around 70%, and we'd give each other feedback, and then we'd establish trust. Trust is built over time. Trust happens when you share your perspective with your team, and you tell them what we need to improve on and what worked and what didn't work so well. And you have that shared responsibility. So you're all working together towards a common goal, and that is to be more efficient and to be better as a team. And eventually, over time, when nothing bad happens, you're able to give, 100% honest feedback. That's the glue that holds us all together. It enables us to be a balanced team where everybody's opinion is important and the team drives the process and the product forward. Okay, let's check back in on our scorecard. We're doing pretty well. We've implemented all the steps that we said we would talk about in this presentation. But we've kind of come all this way, and I haven't really talked about DevOps. What is DevOps? It's really an umbrella term for development, QA, operations, the people who have their fingers on the keyboard and eyes on the glass. And lean startup is like management and accounting. We could easily describe it as that. Okay? It's a way to develop qualitative and quantitative metrics. Innovation accounting to determine are we building the right stuff. But DevOps is more of something that's more intangible. It's not a thing, it's a way of working. It's a way of aligning everyone. Imagine this. Imagine if your operations person sat with your software developer and said, hey, when you give code to me, I have to modify some configuration files. I have to write some scripts before I can actually push that code to production. Well, what does that lead to? Well, in my old world, that led to scheduled releases. And when we talk about delivering continuously, that's not what we want to do. But imagine what would happen if you had these two people actually sit together in the same location. I would imagine that, an operations person would say, hey, this is what happens when you give me code. And the developer might say, wow, I could make a minor tweak and make your life easier. What would happen? They would pair together. They would understand each other's perspective. They would have empathy for each other. So all of this together is DevOps. Pairing, automating everything, bringing everyone closer together, and aligning them around a process, developing greater trust, and delivering all the time. Together, we can be better. That's what DevOps is. I would bet that your evolution, your transformation is going to look just like ours. It's going to happen from the inside out. And, when you start in that first day, whether you're walking down that path or you're diving into that pool, the water's going to feel cold, okay? You're going to start swimming. You're going to get halfway across, and you're going to hit a roadblock or a significant, setback, okay? And you're going to want to stop. You're going to want to turn back. And I would encourage you to keep going, because at the other side is a transformed team. And in the process, you get to transform yourself. So the world is indeed changing, but it isn't all doom and gloom. There is a better way. If you adopt this new way of working, if you change your work patterns, if you focus on learning by doing and continuously learning and enabling your team by bringing them together and letting them work together, you can transform your company, you can transform your team, and most importantly, you can transform yourself. And in the process, you can transform the world with the great software that you're going to deliver. I want to thank you guys today. The value of a talk like this is the thought that it provokes. And I can't do a Q&A with a group of this size, but I do hope that you will come visit us at the booth downstairs. My team is here. We have some great prizes, some great demonstrations that we want to do, and even a special announcement this week. So please do connect with me on Twitter. I really hope you will tell me about your transformation, and I hope that you will seek me out at this conference, in the pavilion, at the Village, so we can, you can actually put me on the spot and ask me questions, and I can share with you how we've overcome roadblocks to transform ourselves. Thank you, everyone, for your time today.